Hi, my name is Robert Haas. I have been working at EDB for about 15 years now. I first got involved in PostgreSQL development in about 2008. Prior to that, I spent about 10 years working as a web application developer. So I had a bunch of hands-on experience as a PostgreSQL user, and eventually I got really interested in the problems that were too hard to solve as a user, and I decided I wanted to start trying to make the software itself better. It's what I've been doing ever since. So thank you very much, Flor, for having me with you today.
Hi, I'm Martín Marqués. Been with EDB since the acquisition of Second Quadrant. I've been with Second Quadrant and EDB for 12 years. I've been a DBA before that, a support engineer, and now I'm in a role of director of engineering, basically managing the teams that do backups, and automation.
All right. So my name is Israel. I've been with DB since the acquisition of Second Quadrant 5 years ago. I used it to work as a developer of web applications in the past, plus logic inside the database. So I used it to use Postgres for coding procedures and functions for calculation of taxes in my previous company. And since I joined EDB on Second Quadrant, I've been working on a few different fronts. I worked already on support on RDBA, and since the last couple of years, I've been working on development in the teams of Martin. And we, as you said, we work with high availability and backup mainly.
Perfect. And we're all here to talk about the Postgres 18 release and some of the patches that went in there and that we at EDB had did some work on. So I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about the incremental backup feature that and the Postgres 17 release that introduced that functionality, Robert?
Yeah, sure. So in PostgreSQL 17, we got a basic incremental backup feature. And the basic idea here is just that if you have a really large database and it isn't changing very quickly, you would like to avoid copying the entire thing every time you do a backup. So if you have a small database, then it's going to be simpler probably to just copy the whole thing every time you do a backup. And if you have a database where all of the data is constantly being renewed, then it isn't really going to help you very much to use incremental backup. But of course, many people do have databases which are large and slowly changing. And in that case, being able to copy only the data that has changed and not all of the data can be a really significant advantage. For example, you might have a database where 5% of your data changes on a typical day. So that would mean that incremental backup would potentially allow you to copy 5% of your database size instead of 100% of your database size. And then at restore time, we would fill in the rest from what is present in older backups. And so one advantage of that is that your backups might be smaller to store on disk, but a probably bigger advantage of that is that it would make the actual process of taking the backup quicker. Because for a lot of customers who have really large databases, it's not necessarily the storage space that gets them, but the effort of having to send all of that data over the network every day. So that's really what we're hoping to optimize here with that feature.
And you said something like initial release. So did you always know that there was going to be stuff that was going to be built on top of it, or did you have ideas for stuff that needed to be built on top of it?
Yeah, I did. And we've added a small enhancement to it in version 18, small at least in terms of code size, but maybe larger in terms of impact. And I think that's one of the challenges with a feature like this is that I can see from my perspective as a feature developer that not everything that somebody is potentially going to want is here, but I don't always know exactly which things are going to actually be points of friction for people. And so the work that Israel did with link mode for PostgreSQL 18 really came out of that, came out of saying, well, hey, you've got the core of the technology here. That's cool and everything, but there are use cases that are hard for us to satisfy unless you give us a little bit more. And that's a really good example of how you get much better results with software development when there's a feedback loop where people are not just either loving your feature or hating it, but they're actually telling you, hey, I like what you've done here, but it doesn't quite meet my needs for whatever the reason may be. And then maybe even, as in this case, helping you to address those gaps and move things into a better direction. And I'm sure that there are going to be other people who try incremental backup and run into other kinds of problems. And one of the great things about working in an open source community is one possibility is those people might just show up and complain, but an even better possibility is that they might show up and say, look, here's what you could do on top of what has already been done that would really help. And I think that's a really great property of open source.
Maybe we can talk about some of those changes that were needed for incremental backup, or what stuff was needed, on top of that for Barman specifically, and your role in that patch, Israel.
Yeah, sure. So through Barman 3.11, we introduced the feature of the support for the incremental backups, the block level ones that are exposed by Postgres server. Before that, we already had something that we call a backup method in Barman, which you can specify how you want to take your backups. So in this new Barman version that we released back then, we made the adjustments to the tool so it could take the incremental backups. So it had several small increments on top of the existing source code base of Barman. One of them was adding an incremental flag to the Barman backup command in such a way that you could specify the parent of your incremental backup. That information is basically relayed to the PG-based backup, as Barman works as a wrapper. And we also had to perform some other changes, like changing the internal backup catalog of Barman, its metadata of backups, so it could handle and distinguish between the full and incremental backups. And it could also transparently combine the backups for the user when restoring the backups, and also to be able to perform checks like the consistency of your chain of backups, the eligibility of the backups for the incrementals. So we had this series of small changes on the existing source code base to make it adopt to the incremental feature that we have in Postgres. While working on this feature in the Barman front, I submitted a few small patches, but most of my work was related with designing the feature with the team and guiding them and helping with reviews and testing of their patches.
And does it now, in its current form, does it fit the need?
Yes, it basically leverages all the features that we have in PG-based backup. So we adapt this wrapper to support the incremental feature. It's working fine. Of course, we have ideas for improvements. As Robert mentioned, we did that with the new link mode in PG Combined backup for the 18, but those are ideas that come out from the features that we have and from the feedback that we have from the users, customers, and from the community.
Maybe to discuss a little bit what's next, or what's some more things that might be on the wish list, we can ask Martin.
Well, for the wish list, the things that are coming, there's one that is the evergreen, which is the thing about not taking a full backup ever again. We kind of call it the sliding window, where like your full backup and all your incrementals are like moving forward as you add new incremental backups, just combining the old ones to generate new synthetic full backups and moving the whole chain to the future. So you always have like a retention window that is what you configure, but the rest is just discarded by combining older backups. So that is one feature that we still have to like fully design how it would look in Barman.
Yeah, so I'm curious because I only recently learned that work on the next version, so 19 already starts in July, months before the current version, or Postgres 18 comes out. So is this something that could be considered for 19, or when is it too late to think about these things?
Yeah, so the earliest that I've started working on a feature for a certain release was January of the year before. You know, it's a long process to create a really good patch that is worthy of being included in a PostgreSQL release, because the project has a lot of very justifiable concern with keeping the quality up, because we're talking about software that is holding people's critical data, and we really want to get it right as much as we can. Now, of course, PostgreSQL has bugs because all software has bugs, but we work really hard to keep that quality standard up. And so I think there's a lot of projects where you really have to start early and be prepared to put in a lot of effort to get things polished to an acceptable level before you're going to have something that is going to get shipped.
Yeah, I think so. So sometimes would it then sort of like skip a release just because of its size?
Yeah, I mean, it all depends on the situation, right? I have definitely seen people, most of whom were either committers at the time or later became committers, who proposed relatively large things at the last minute, and everybody was like, "Oh yeah, that totally makes sense. Looks good. Ship it." Right? But so that does sometimes happen, but a lot of times it doesn't. A lot of times, again, even from very senior hackers, there are things that people don't fully anticipate how things are going to go. So you need to give yourself the time to develop the patch, but then you also need to give yourself the time to discuss the patch with other people and get their feedback and input on things that you may have missed.
And now you touched on like, oh, you're waiting for, you need to get the input from the community and from people outside of the company, and of course they're not available at the exact time that you might want them to be available to you. So how does that work, and sort of how does the communication with the community at large looks like for release?
Yeah, I think the thing that I would say, first of all, is that this is another one of the things that I love about working on PostgreSQL and working in the PostgreSQL community. There are a lot of people working on PostgreSQL who are just incredibly good developers, and I get a lot of my intellectual stimulation from interacting with those people. It can be really great when somebody comes up with a clever way of addressing some problem that you didn't think of. And you're like, wow, I wish I could be smart like that person. And it happens to me pretty regularly. So I do love that about it. But of course, there's also things that you have to be patient with. People have their own priorities, sometimes based on their personal choice, sometimes based on what their employer wants them to be working on. So, and that's something that you have to plan around, right? So I often think, very early in the process of coming up with some feature that I might want to propose in the PostgreSQL community. Well, what is this? How is this going to land? Is this going to be an idea that I think people are going to embrace? Are there going to be concerns? What are those concerns likely to be? And I talk with people, at conferences. I post mails on the list. I try to understand. Part of my role as a developer is not just to write the code, but to figure out how to work with the community and with internal stakeholders at EDB and come up with mutually acceptable solutions where everybody can hopefully get the things that are most important to them.
Israel, I'm sort of like interested. How did the sort of the communication within the Postgres community, and then like folks that work on Barman at EDB looks like? Because it seems like you had quite some, quite the range of stakeholders to talk with, and I'm curious how how that looks like.
Right. So we have kind of a different processing between the projects. We have Postgres, which is uh, it belongs to the larger community. We have a larger base of users and contributors which are working around. On the other hand, we have Barman, which is an open source project, but it's mostly maintained by EDB. We have these two different fronts, although they are open to the public. They have kind of different ways of leading the development, and that's actually something that we would like to bring more to Barman, like expanding the ecosystem of contributors in the tool. So in a way that we could have more coordination and collaboration between ADB as the primary maintainer of the tool, but also with the users that are around. It's not like we don't get contributions from the community, but they are not so often as we have in the Postgres ecosystem.
Yeah. This is maybe more my curiosity, but what do you what do you think keeps people from contributing to Barman then?
I guess it takes effort to build a community, really active community. You can also think of, let's say, the impact of each project. Barman is a backup tool, and if you think of Postgres, databases are everywhere. So I think these are the kind of things that take some portion of the work here. But in the case of Postgres, we are talking about a pioneer database, which has been working on for 40 years. It was really community-driven since the very early stages of its development. And that's what we would like to get with Barman, like trying to find ways of getting more engagement from the users, opening a bit more the discussions and the issues, and building this collaborative environment where people can come and we can discuss together and move the project forward with them.
I think we have good communication with the community. We get some PRs. Sometimes we get a PR without anybody like opening an issue, and we asking, hey, can you collaborate? They just like open the PR, or they open the issue and the PR all together. That's very nice, and it happens. I also think that maybe it's not so fair for Barman, given that everybody uses Postgres that uses Barman, right? Like if you use Barman, you have a Postgres server. But not everybody that has Postgres uses Barman. Some people use other tools. Some people just take PGBase backup. Some take snapshot backups. Like there's all kinds of ways of taking your backups, but like we're a fraction of the Postgres community, and I think we get a good amount of responses. There are things that we're still missing. Like we have been talking with Israel about creating developer documentation. Like we have user documentation that we revamped and everybody's very happy about it. But we also wanted to add like developer contributions in the documentation. Like, okay, how do I set up an environment to test a certain feature? Because yeah, it's easy to, test stuff like configuration changes with Barman by installing packages, but it's not very clear how to set up an environment just by downloading the source code of Barman. And that is something that we would like to put in a document. We would also like to sort of document how we do development or work together with the community with the patches that they send. So like if they open a PR, how is the interaction between the Barman team and whoever provided the PR going to look like, and how it's going to work out. Once we have those things out there, I think it's going to be much clearer, and it's going to be easier for somebody who actually uses Barman and maybe says, yeah, I'd like to contribute something that I need. Like if they know how to, it might be much easier for them, or more transparent, or they would be more eager to contribute something.
Yeah. The development process of Postgres is much more stable and open and transparent in that sense. And I guess that's one place that we need to work a bit on Barman. Like Martin said, we have this structure for the developer documentation in the Barman docs, but we still don't have all the steps documented there, so people can easily get involved and know what are the exact steps and the expectations that they have about it.
Yeah, I hate to hold up PostgreSQL as a perfect example of this because, of course, PostgreSQL has things that it could improve as well. Um, but it does have some of the kinds of things that you're talking about, at least to a degree, like documentation about how to set up an environment and stuff like that. I think some of the difference between the two projects has to do with scale. In a given year, the number of pretty active developers for PostgreSQL is 100 and something. It's over 100, and I don't know what the number is for Barman, but I'm guessing it's a much smaller number, right? So that just causes you to be forced to create some infrastructure that you don't necessarily get with a smaller scale project. But as you're doing, you can be thoughtful about that and be like, oh yeah, we might get more contributions if people understood what the process is.
What are some of the features or fixes in Postgres 18 that you're specifically interested in or looking forward to, aside, of course, from your own work landing and people starting using that and giving you feedback?
From my side, I really like the work that Amul did with PG Verify backup on Tarball. I think that it's something that is really interesting to have.
I guess there's also the most impacting change, if you think about it, when you read the release notes, which is the asynchronous I/O in Postgres. I guess that kickoff that we have there is going to open a lot of room for improvements in performance over time. So the idea is that you don't block Postgres anymore, when you need to perform some kind of I/O. So your backends are to kill the request to the I/O device and continue with other work that doesn't depend on that. I guess once that gets more mature and widely used over the code base, that might improve a lot performance.
I do agree with Israel that the async IO stuff is interesting. I think there's actually been a lot of really interesting performance work that has been done in this release. And I think both AIO and some of the other things are sort of in a state where there may be some benefits now, but we're also looking forward to what we can build on in the future. The PostgreSQL philosophy is really about incremental development. So it's often the case that something that you might expect to land as a big bang is actually spread out over time. And I think that we're going to look back on the AIO work and see it that way. But for example, Peter Gagan worked on some improvements to P-tree indexes for this release, which basically improve the efficiency of how the index can be used for certain query shapes. And that builds on other work that he did to improve the use of B-tree indexes in the previous. So I don't know. I know there's going to be some things in this release that people are super excited about just for what the feature is today. But I see this release personally, just like based on what I think is most exciting, more as a step along a journey in terms of some things, some arcs of work to optimize certain things and make certain things better are reaching their conclusion, and other strains of work are just kind of getting started, and we're going to see those maybe go someplace interesting in future releases. One example of that, which isn't even really called out that much in the release notes, is that a whole bunch of different people working at a whole bunch of different companies went around and removed calls to non-thread safe functions from large parts of the PostgreSQL backend. Now, that is infrastructure toward a possible future where instead of having a process for every session, maybe someday we're going to have a thread for every session. There's no real benefit immediately to the fact that that work is in the release, but it had to be done in order for that future feature to ever become a possibility. So we don't know what's going to happen with that. Certainly, there are people working on it and thinking about it, and maybe that will become a reality in the future. But it's just kind of another example of how a lot of these sort of sea changes that you see happen in PostgreSQL over the years actually take shape over the course of a release, of several releases rather. And as you're looking at them as they're happening, you're like, oh, that was a little bit small. That was a little bit small. That was a little bit small. But then when you look at it 5 years down the line, you're like, oh, no, that wasn't small at all. That actually
It was
really
huge.
changed
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
way we
Yeah.
thought about certain things.
Yeah. That is really nice. So we'll be having the same conversation next year then.
I
Can we
I
agree on that?
imagine we will. Yeah.